And it's a real pleasure to be here and to be sharing this space with you all, and to be listening to and engaging with Verity and Nadia's presentations. And I think that there's a fair bit of overlap with some of the points that Verity was making in her fascinating opening presentation. I'm going to speak very much from my experience of working in a small specialist institution. And I think one of the strengths of the UK research system is the fact that research takes place across multiple areas and sectors. And too often, I think, when research is mentioned, it's kind of assumed it's centered in Russell Group institutions. Already some of the questions we're talking about Oxford and Cambridge and the privilege they hold and the positions that they occupy. But the landscape, I think, is a little bit more inclusive and complex than that, although institutions don't always recognise their privilege. The HEI sector includes post-1992 institutions, research institutes, small specialist or single subject institutions like my own. But beyond HE, and Verity was discussing this, research is conducted by industry bodies and companies, government, independent research organisations. I would argue, however, that much of the guidance that's produced in relation to research is fashioned with large, multi-faculty, higher education institutions in mind. So it's not easy for bodies who don't fit that shape and size to always see what fostering excellence might look like, or how they adhere to sector guidance that might relegate their type of institution to a footnote. My institution has submitted to research assessment exercises since 1996 and remains committed to an understanding of creative arts practice with research at the core. But I am consistently surprised when people ask me, oh, you're in a conservatoire and you do research in your conservatoire? Well, yes, we do. And we try and do it well and with due diligence and a consideration of what accountability means to those who undertake the research, to the institution, and to the relationship to funders and those who publish or disseminate research. So I think that a commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion involves recognising the different kinds of institution that make up our research ecology in the UK. Opting for a one-size-fits-all approach feels limiting and it feels problematic. But we need to recognise that a commitment to the principles outlined in the Concordat to support research integrity need to be part of our research culture, whatever our shape or size, and recognise that how we implement them may depend on a series of factors. So by looking at some of the challenges and opportunities involved in nurturing research within small specialist institutions, I want to provide some examples of how at the Monotechnic, where I am based, we've attempted to promote research practices with inclusivity, integrity and accountability at the core. And I'm using the we here in a very conscious way, because at the core has been a commitment to change from across the research base. So today's presentation is not simply my view, but as with today's webinar, in many ways, a co-production that draws on input from a number of my colleagues at Central. And these include the previous and the current chairs of our Research Ethics and Integrity Committee, a recent PhD graduate from Central who's now an ECR with responsibility for promoting integrity built into their workload allocation, a former ECR who was with us for a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship, who's now gone on to a permanent position at another London higher education institution, an ECR who had a postdoctoral position and has now joined us as a permanent member of staff. And this member of staff did their PhD in undergraduate and had postdocs at other institutions before joining us, and our head of research and knowledge exchange services. These colleagues are also at different career stages and represent different kinds of lived experience in terms of their journey into higher education. So research environments are evolving entities. They're shifting and changing as staff come and go, as PhD researchers come and go, as professional services staff come and go. They evolve as new partnerships and collaborations are developed, new partnerships are built, and this all moves research in different directions. Evolution is key here, the open research agenda, the increasing recognition of the importance of integrity to a robust and accountable research culture, the heightened awareness of EDI. All of these are affecting, in positive ways, I would argue, how researchers and institutions think about the conduct of research. An institution like mine also has a very significant proportion of staff who've come from industry. And they work on professional practice and knowledge exchange, but don't necessarily undertake research-led practice or what is seen as more traditional forms of arts and humanities, archival research, for example. Their work does, however, crucially feed into and shape the research environment, because we know that the relationship between knowledge exchange and impact is porous, and that not all impact is necessarily research-led. I think terminology needs a little bit of rethinking here, so that those who work in those areas understand also how and why issues of integrity, honesty, rigor, transparency, and open communication, care, respect, accountability are equally important to public engagement or the knowledge exchange work that they undertake. I would say that accountability is about all of us at an institution, whether we're on a research pathway or not a research pathway, whether we're in academic or in professional services. We all have a responsibility to be accountable to ourselves, to others, and to the work that we do. Key here, I would argue, has been the focus on fostering a productive and transparent research environment, working to implement changes that help this happen. So, for example, an ethics and integrity committee, we didn't have one when I arrived at the institution in October 2015. We introduced one in 2016. Previously, research ethics and integrity was an agenda item on the research committee. We were part of, or are part of, and continue to be part of, a Conservatoire UK Ethics Committee, but introducing our own standalone committee has allowed for a more robust discussion of the relationship between ethics and integrity, embedded training across the research base, and also to those delivering teaching where research may be where students may be undertaking research-led practice and projects. And it's also ensured membership from across the postgraduate research candidates, as well as ECRs, mid-career researchers, more senior researchers, as well as practitioners who are navigating ethical issues and issues of integrity in their practice. So, for example, academic staff members with expertise in intimacy training or in health and safety, in design and technical work, for example. We also have an external, a lay member of the committee with expertise from the charity sector and the commissioning of research. And that's been hugely important. I can talk about that later if anybody's interested, but it relates to, again, to some of the issues that Verity was answering in her questions. We've also tried to ensure that training happens through mentoring, both formal and informal. So for the chair, with training opportunities coming in more formal mentoring opportunities and informal mentoring discussions in terms of opening up access to leaders in the field who've navigated, thorny issues and questions, but also training for the whole committee. We had a session not so long ago run by a former Pro VC for research in another institution who chaired their college research ethics committee. So I think an ownership of the process has been critical here, and our scale, about 80 to 90 academic members of staff, means that information can circulate and filter through the institution, perhaps a little bit more easily than in a larger institution. It doesn't mean it always does, but the facility is there for it to circulate. Once a year, we have a session for all staff in developments in ethics and integrity. So discussions about integrity have become part of the fabric of what we do. The chair of the Ethics and Integrity Committee sits on our sabbatical and awards committee and our research committee, as well as academic board. Intersections and interactions. As the former chair of our Ethics and Integrity Committee observes, and here I quote, "The ethics work brought up ethics as part of the conversation, and that made for better, more ethically engaged work. At the root of ethics is care, and that made for a more careful ethics culture, the development of ethics processes that connected to sector practice and where there was an opportunity to shape ethics in a way that better suited the art forms in which we work, i.e. not a system that was predicated on science or sociological foundations, but nevertheless committed to the Concordat principles, allowed us a fit-for-purpose process for ethical consideration, a process that was both robust and quick to respond, end quote. I would argue that the committee's work has impacted on all areas of the institution and how researchers think about and navigate power, privilege, responsibility, and accountability within Central, but also beyond. How do you ask a question at a conference? Are you gatekeeping? Are you intervening when you witness unethical or problematic behavior? Care and respect as fundamental to how we treat each other across all our research encounters. We introduced an expectations document this year to help researchers understand what's expected of them, but also to ensure that those of us in leadership positions lay out transparently how we will endeavour to support and foster a healthy and inclusive research environment. Integrity is about recognising our responsibilities, whether we're institutional leaders, funders, researchers, or professional services staff. The decision we made to build an integrity role into an ECR's workload has also had, I would argue, far-reaching implications. It's offered the person concerned what they've identified, and I quote, as key insights into local and national conversations around ethics and integrity. My role working on ethics also means I'm constantly learning and developing my own ethical praxis, gaining a wider understanding of ethics in research more generally, and it allows me to highlight the needs of ECRs, end quote. Colleagues repeatedly refer to the difference that distributed leadership has made in the institution, with staff holding delegated responsibility for particular areas that avoids a single point of success or failure and fosters working relationships that have brought ECRs and more senior researchers together on a regular basis. Our REF 2021 strategy and delivery group, for example, had representation from ECRs, part-time staff, those on fixed-term contracts, as well as more senior research leaders. Don't tell people you're giving them a voice, just give them the opportunity to drive change. Doing, the Cuban poet Jose Marti once wrote, is the best way of saying. One of the ECRs I spoke to writes of having, and I quote, benefited from joining committees, working groups, interview panels, British Academy funding review panels, and so on, which gave me an insight into decision-making and how a research environment is built. As an ECR, I don't think I would have had those opportunities in a bigger department or institution, end quote. They now note that they're part of committees in their new HEI where they're able to draw on this gained experience in understanding how the reviewing of projects and ethics materials fits into an institutional context. The issue of training emerges throughout the discussions with those who shared their views with me for this presentation, fostering awareness, learning about best practice, sharing thoughts, discussing possible options. Training, the previous chair of our Ethics and Integrity Committee observes, involves opening up research meetings, PhD supervisors meetings, as well as committee meetings as, and I quote, training moments as well as business, end quote. Training, as one ECR notes, improved their ability to think about their role and agency within a wider environment. Researchers don't always know about concordats or feel that they have the time to read them. I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of them and they overlap and they duplicate information. I would ask, have they been read by neurodivergent researchers before they go into a public domain? But that's perhaps a different conversation. Training ensures that the principles become part of the lived experience of the institution. You can aim higher, another ECR mentioned to me, when you know there are people with the capacity and expertise to support you, end quote. A further issue identified by those I spoke to is that of ensuring there's time built into the workload allocation for research, the management of research, and the activities that shape research in the institution and the wider discipline. And here I'm talking about roles on subject associations, peer review, editing, civic work, etc. Mistakes are more likely to be made when research is undertaken in a rushed or hurried manner. Transparent internal funding streams for research and a clear, transparent sabbatical process with guidance and criteria written in plain English and checked by neurodivergent researchers have been key here. Sabbaticals and the introduction of new funding streams to support teaching buyout for grant applications, impact, completion of outputs, support for building partnerships to support collaborative research are all identified by the researchers as having helped to build a more inclusive research culture with a greater sense of accountability. You know what you need to deliver, and you're aware of the need to fulfill the objectives laid out in the application you make for funding. It's also helped to build morale, I would argue, and offered the time needed to apply for external funding, and time is key here. We've recognised the labour involved in supporting research through subject association and editorial roles, providing financial support in the form of teaching buyout or research assistant that acknowledges the work involved in taking these roles on. So it allows a broader number of researchers to take on these roles. This work cannot and should not remain invisible. It's absolutely key to the effective operation of peer review, to disciplinary development, to the allocation of funding. And yet, how do we recognise that work? I think this is an issue of accountability. At Central, about 24% of our researchers are neurodivergent. And I've worked very closely with our Neuro Inclusion and Disability Service unit to ensure that we have reasonable adjustment with support that takes different shapes and forms depending on the needs and requests of the researcher. The current chair of our Research Ethics and Integrity Committee, who's neurodivergent, writes of this, and I quote, "Levelling the playing field between researchers. Support in the form of proofreading and copy editing was useful, but the weekly support sessions from a trained specialist have proved to be invaluable. Since receiving this support 5 years ago, I've published a monograph, a co-edited book, 2 journal articles, and 7 book chapters, and have become the co-editor of a leading journal, and submitted 1 HRC grant application. Without this support, in the previous 3 years, I wrote 1 journal article," end quote. Key here is what she identifies, and I quote again, as a nuanced response to individual researchers and their needs and circumstances that understands that a diverse research team has different requirements and adjustments, the genuine understanding that research incorporates a variety of styles and approaches, end quote. Supporting researchers in ways that recognise their needs is a matter of integrity and, I would argue, institutional accountability. How can we support them to undertake the very best, most rigorous, most honest research they can? Are funders making reasonable allocations? Is the guidance they issue accessible in the most inclusive sense of the word? And if we don't recognise and acknowledge the needs of all our researchers and work to address these, can we be surprised if they falter? I want to end briefly with some of the challenges of creating an accountable research environment, because there are always challenges, and what happens when things go wrong, because they do go wrong. And here I'm also drawing from thoughts from those other institutions who are involved in fostering or leading a research culture, as well as ECRs I've spoken to in other fora. So it's a broader pool of individuals here that I'm drawing on their views. I think, firstly, we live in a world where the performance of punishment can be brutal, and it's carried out at times in a very public manner. And also where the drive to achieve success, and I put success in inverted commas because I'm sometimes not sure what constitutes success, because what I define as success, others don't define as success. I think it can lead to problematic practices. Research, I would argue, is slow. It's slow for me. It takes time, and it might be because I came to English as a second language. You know, it's an acquired language for me. I've had to learn to navigate that language. The effects of COVID, I think, on our research culture are still being felt, and they've affected certain researchers disproportionately, those with caring responsibilities, those navigating health conditions, for example. I think research, and this goes back to something Verity was talking about, it shouldn't be about quantity. It's important to shift the discourse to an understanding that sometimes research experiments fail. Arguments don't come together the way we may wish. We get things wrong and we learn from this, and we share the lessons learned with others. And acknowledging those failures and dealing with those failures has to be part of a healthy research culture. And I think this is a big question for us all, I think, how we find places for the acknowledgement that something hasn't worked out. I think it's crucial. And I increasingly talk about slow research, research that needs time, research where time is built in to check and check again. As Verity articulated in quoting from one of the persons she talked to this morning, research isn't a competition. It shouldn't be a competition. One of the challenges I think involved is also the need to understand that that a research ecosystem within an institution isn't just about a research office, research support staff and researchers. Accountability needs to be recognized across an entire HEI, from academics to HR and finance offices, estates and IT. If our collaborators are not paid on time, if contracts are not issued in a timely manner, it could affect how research is undertaken. Additionally, as one of my colleagues writes, wider institutional infrastructures and systems are, and I quote here from them, at times set up in a way that they hamper diverse colleagues. Research can't be sidelined and put into a box in the corner, whatever the size and scale of the institution. Its key services, processes and systems, and those responsible for them, have a duty to recognise the need for the needs of researchers and the research services provision that supports research, and the responsibilities that institutions have to those that fund our research. And it's not just that researchers or research offices have that need, but I would argue all parts of the institution. And I think HEIs need to show how they're addressing, for example, the Tickle Review recommendations as part of their accountability. Are institutional processes fit for purpose, or are they compromising the ability to deliver research projects from design to delivery? You know, research, as others have mentioned, is about time and resource, and accountability must recognize responsibilities across an institution. And when things go wrong, what do we do? Well, I think firstly, we need to be willing to have difficult conversations and intervene. And in a context where punishment is performed very publicly, where people often are taking quite polarized positions. We live in a very polarized culture at present. You know, it's not easy sometimes to address poor practices when we see them or when they're brought to our attention, and not easy to have difficult conversations and follow up those actions when which are very often necessary. Sometimes we need to bring in external assistance to help us with the management of perceived conflicts of interest or possible infringements, publishers, for example, but also other individuals with responsibility for ethics and integrity at other institutions. I think that's very important when you've got small institutions like mine. Honest errors, minor infractions can be handled often through mentoring, training and guidance, but not always. And I think acting in a timely manner to investigate allegations of misconduct is key. It's worth acknowledging, I think, however, that putting together a screening panel and an investigation panel isn't always easy in a single subject institution with a pool of 35 rather than 3,000 researchers, and conflicts of interest that need managing across all levels. The named contact for allegations of misconduct may have 4 other responsibilities within a small specialist institution. A panel may need to be put together entirely from externals. Where do you go for help with this? It's often, I would argue, informal networks of pro-VCs or directors of research in small specialist institutions that can assist with this, but obviously paying very close attention to the need to ensure that confidentiality is never compromised. Question: could investigations be outsourced to HEIs of a particular size and scale? Could there be a database of citizens to help with investigations held by each HEI's named person? What support is there for managing for those managing the investigations if privacy and confidentiality are compromised and material circulates in the public domain? How do care and respect manifest themselves here? No easy answers, I think, but they're issues that need to be considered and thought through. I'm going to stop now, but I want to end with some observations from those I spoke to about what made a difference to them in terms of understanding research that the public can have confidence in and accountability. And these were the points made: persistence and a clarity of direction from those in leadership positions, ensuring that positive behaviour is acknowledged and recognised. So often we focus on the negative, we don't celebrate and showcase the positive. Providing spaces and time for listening and for offering support. Distributed leadership that acknowledges and rewards responsibility, ensuring researchers' needs are addressed. Live, flexible research services staff who provide support and challenge when needed. Guidance that is inclusive. And I end with a quote from one of the ECRs I spoke with. The work to create a research culture at Central involves understanding the diverse needs of researchers from a range of backgrounds and disciplines and responding to those needs while holding researchers accountable to wider processes. This is reflected in the wider national conversation, where a national research culture is only effective when it is sensitive to the needs of the diverse research topics, methods and structures across the research sector in the UK, and particularly those of small specialist institutions. We can't build research cultures on the highest common denominator, and I hope a national picture can learn from some of the in-depth work being done here and at other SSIs. Thank you.
Maria, thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. I'd like to thank you, but also the many diverse perspectives you challenged and gave voice to during the presentation. It was fascinating and very enthusiastic to hear. We've had lots of interesting questions come through in the Q&A already. And the first question was Fiona Brainerd, who asked if you could elaborate a little on the impact of your lay charity sector committee member on your activities, please.
Yeah, I mean, when the Ethics and Integrity Committee we have has evolved quite a lot, and in many ways we were navigating through conversations with the Conservatoires UK Ethics Committee and the discussions that our then chair was having with other committee chairs, and I know that they found the UK Rio webinars an amazing training opportunity and discursive opportunity, and really it was a suggestion about when we looked at what the membership should consist of. In the beginning it was largely researchers, and we thought actually we need to open this out because there's people in the institution we're not having conversations with. And as we started to think about people within the institutions, we began to think about so much of our research is collaborative. I think about 63% of our outputs for REF were collaborative. And we were thinking about some of those people that we collaborate with out with the HEI sector. Let's think about how we bring those views in. And we had a number of suggestions and that came to the committee. And this was somebody who had a doctorate, understood research, had undertaken research themselves, was working in international development and navigating some issues there, but also was a commissioner of research. And so we thought that they brought a number of different perspectives. So one of the things that was a consideration was, how can, what kind of lived experience and professional experience do they bring? And this was somebody, when we were discussing a pool of possible lay members, who seemed to bring a number of different areas to the table, and they've been amazing, quite frankly, really amazing. Also in looking at our paperwork and ensuring that it's understood by those working in the charity sector or in industry. I mean, a number of our members on the committee regularly work in industry, so they're not they're in fractional posts, so that they're not just based within our institution. So they're navigating their industry relationships and their prior industry experience as they are as they're undertaking the work in the committee. So it's really been about this idea of evolving. I mean, I think often, you know, you think of a structure and you think, okay, we'll write it down in stone. These are the terms of reference. And actually, I think as your research needs change, as your own, you know, research community changes, different areas of research acquire a new predominance within your institution, you need to think about the membership of that committee and whether it brings you the experience, that the different kinds of lived experience you have and expertise that you need to be able to kind of improve the research culture and to be able to argue through and discuss the ethical issues and the issues of integrity that we all know are seminal to creating a healthy research culture.
Thank you. I've had two questions in relation to neurodiversity, both from anonymous attendees. The first was, how have you identified that 24% of your researchers are neurodivergent? And the second one, simply if you could point to some resources to support neurodiverse people, considering the impact you noted this had within your institution.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the, we had a percentage when I arrived in the institution, but in conversations I was having, I felt that there were probably more researchers who were neurodivergent that hadn't been tested. And I think often researchers are slightly, they don't want to be tested. They feel that it's problematic because it might be associated with particular experiences they've had at school or when undertaking their PhDs. So I think entering into that conversation about whether, you know, whether somebody wants to be tested, wants to enter into a discussion, was one of the areas. Those are the ones where they are 24% are those where they have been formally diagnosed as having some neurodivergence. So they have had formal diagnosis, as I said, some, you know, many years before, and some during, you know, during their time at Central. In every case of everyone I've spoken to, they have found it enabling to have the diagnosis, and secondly, because many of them had the diagnosis previously to 2016, to have reasonable adjustment built in, to have one-to-one conversations that don't say, here's a set of resources, off you go with them, but actually, what do you need? And it's really different. It's incredibly different depending on the researcher. Not all of them want that one-to-one support. Some of them want enhanced research mentoring from an academic mentor. Some of them want some external counseling from and advice and mentoring and guidance from other networks outside the institution. So there isn't a magic wand that you can wave to say, here's a bunch of resources, off you go. It doesn't work like that. I think building time in to have conversations with them and gaining trust is really, really important. And it's listening. It's about listening, not coming in, charging in, saying, here you go, off you go. You've got to listen to what they need, because they do work. They need to find what is the most productive way of working for them with those reasonable adjustments. The reasonable adjustments may need changing. The expectations definitely need changing. You know, when I had a conversation with one neurodivergent who said, I don't know how I'm going to produce 4 outputs for ref. And I said, you don't need to produce 4 outputs for ref. One, by then we knew it was 2.5, but actually, you know, you need to manage this within the institution. If somebody has had periods of maternal leave, caring responsibilities, if they're neurodivergent, you can't expect 4 outputs. You shouldn't expect 4. You need to work with them to work out what is manageable for them, what empowers them to do the best research possible. And it's about having those conversations. And we live in a world where too often it's a one-size-fits-all approach. Here you go, it's this much, get on with it. No, it can't be. It can't be. If we really have a commitment to inclusivity, there's no way you can have the same expectations of every researcher, because you do not create a level playing field. It is as simple as that, as far as I'm concerned.
Maria, thank you very much for that. It was very informative and very much empowering, and I think a call to action. I'm afraid we don't have any time for any more questions. There are a number in the chat, but we'll work with Maria to see how we can respond to the issues that have been raised in the Q&A. So, Maria, thank you very much for your time again today. It's very thought-provoking.